Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Alex. And after that historic speech by Kamala Harris, we need a big thinker here. So Isabel Wilkerson is joining us. I just feel very lucky to have her 7 days away from this election to get her thoughts on where this country is tonight.
That is an excellent booking. I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Thanks, Alex.
Have a great show.
Thank you. Well, Kamala Harris has been a candidate for president for exactly 100 days. And on the 100th day of her presidential campaign, only 7 days to go before Election Day, Kamala Harris once again delivered the most important speech of her life. All recent presidential candidates have had at least 500 days of campaigning before their last closing argument speech as a presidential candidate, not Kamala Harris. When President Biden stepped back from the presidential campaign in July and immediately endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris had the least amount of time to campaign for president than any candidate since the invention of television. And so on August 22nd, when she delivered her acceptance speech after winning the presidential nomination at the Democratic National Convention, that was accurately described then as the most important speech of her life. When she then crushed Donald Trump in a televised presidential debate in September, that was described then as the most important television moment of her life, and it was. But in this historic and quick Kamala Harris presidential campaign, the most important moment just keeps coming. And so tonight, the vice president made her closing case for her candidacy in a powerful speech she chose to deliver at the scene of the crime, the same place where federal and state prosecutors have accused Donald Trump of committing the crime on January 6th of trying to overthrow the presidential election by ordering his troops to go to the Capitol and fight like hell while telling them the lie that he would go to the Capitol with them. Donald Trump is a criminal defendant in Georgia and Washington, D.C. tonight because, among other things, of what he said in that speech on the south side of the White House, in the same place where the Vice President of the United States stood tonight. Like any time-limited, high-pressure event, as the clock ticks down to the final hour, to the final minute, the pressure only builds and builds. And so tonight, on the 100th day of her presidential campaign, with only 7 days left, with a country on edge about the outcome, the first words the vice president spoke that could seem like a mere scheduling point in any other speech were loaded with drama tonight for everyone listening. 1 week from today.
1 week from today, you will have the chance to make a decision that directly impacts your life, the life of your family, and the future of this country we love. And it will probably be the most important vote you ever cast. And this election is more than just a choice between two parties and two different candidates. It is a choice about whether we have a country rooted in freedom for every American or ruled by chaos and division. Many of you watching have probably already cast your ballots. But I know many others are still considering who to vote for, or whether you'll vote at all. So tonight, I will speak to everyone about the choice and the stakes in this election. Look, we know who Donald Trump is. He is the person who stood at this very spot nearly 4 years ago and sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol to overturn the will of the people in a free and fair election. An election that he knew he lost. Americans died as a result of that attack. 140 law enforcement officers were injured because of that attack. And while Donald Trump sat in the White House watching as the violence unfolded on television, he was told by his staff that the mob wanted to kill his own vice president. And Donald Trump responded with 2 words: "So what?" America, that's who Donald Trump is. And that's who is asking you to give him another 4 years in the Oval Office.
1 week from today, at this very hour, we will begin to know, with the polls closed in most of the states, we will begin to know if that speech worked. We will begin to know if the 107 days of the Harris for President campaign delivered us from the madness and criminality of Donald Trump. We will begin to know at this hour, 7 days from now, if Kamala Harris will spend the next 4 years as President of the United States while Donald Trump spends the next 4 years as criminal defendant Donald Trump in trials and appeals.
In less than 90 days, either Donald Trump or I will be in the Oval Office. Okay? On day one, if elected, Donald Trump would walk into that office with an enemies list. When elected, I will walk in with a to-do list full of priorities of what I will get done for the American people. And I will work with everyone, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, to help Americans who are working hard and still struggling to get ahead. I have been honored to serve as Joe Biden's vice president. But I will bring my own experiences and ideas to the Oval Office. My presidency will be different because the challenges we face are different. Our top priority as a nation 4 years ago was to end the pandemic and rescue the economy. Now, our biggest challenge is to lower costs that were rising even before the pandemic and that are still too high. I get it. I still remember our mother sitting at that yellow Formica table, late at night, cup of tea in hand, a pile of bills in front of her, trying to make it all work. And I've heard from so many of you who are facing even greater financial pressures. Donald Trump's answer to you is the same as it was the last time. Another $1 trillion in tax cuts for billionaires and big corporations. And this time, he will pay for it with a 20% national sales tax on everything you buy that is imported. Think about it. Clothes, food, toys, cell phones. A Trump sales tax that would cost the average family nearly $4,000 more a year. And on top of that, you will pay even more if Donald Trump finally gets his way and repeals the Affordable Care Act, which would throw millions of Americans off their health insurance and take us back to when insurance companies had the power to deny people with pre-existing conditions. Well, we are not going back. We are not going back.
Kamala Harris gave herself two jobs to do in tonight's speech. First was to prosecute the case against allowing convicted felon Donald Trump to return to the White House. And the other was to advocate for a Kamala Harris presidency.
What Donald Trump has never understood is that e pluribus unum, out of many, one, isn't just a phrase on a dollar bill. It is a living truth about the heart of our nation. Our democracy doesn't require us to agree on everything. In fact, we like good arguments from time to time. Just think of your own family, right? It's not the American way to not have disagreements. We don't shy away from robust debate. In fact, we like a good debate, don't we? We like a good debate. And the fact that someone disagrees with us does not make them the enemy within. That's right. They are family, neighbors, classmates, co-workers. They are fellow Americans. And as Americans, we rise and fall together. America, for too long, we have been consumed with too much division, chaos, and mutual distrust. And it can be easy then to forget a simple truth. It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. It is time to stop pointing fingers. We have to stop pointing fingers and start locking arms. It is time to turn the page on the drama and the conflict, the fear and division. It is time for a new generation of leadership in America. And I am ready to offer that leadership as the next President of the United States of America. Now look, let me say, I recognize this has not been a typical campaign. Even though I've had the honor of serving as your vice president for the last 4 years, I know that many of you are still getting to know who I am. Well, let me tell you, I am someone who has spent most of my career outside of Washington, D.C., so I know that not all the good ideas come from here. I am not afraid of tough fights against bad actors and powerful interests, because for decades, as a prosecutor and a top law enforcement officer of our biggest state, I won fights against big banks that ripped off homeowners, against for-profit colleges that scammed veterans and students, against predators who abused women and children, and cartels that trafficked in guns, drugs, and human beings. And I did this work because for as long as I can remember, I have always had an instinct to protect. There's something about people being treated unfairly or overlooked that frankly just gets to me. I don't like it. It's what my mother instilled in me, a drive to hold accountable those who use their wealth or power to take advantage of other people. The drive to protect hardworking Americans who aren't always seen or heard and deserve a voice. And I will tell you that is the kind of president I will be. And look, I'll be honest with you, I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. But here's what I promise you. I will always listen to you, even if you don't vote for me. I will always tell you the truth, even if it is difficult to hear. I will work every day to build consensus and reach compromise to get things done. And if you give me the chance to fight on your behalf, there is nothing in the world that will stand in my way.
Vice President Harris ended the most important speech of her life this way.
America, I know the vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us. I know it. And that's why I am in this race, to fight for the people, just like I always have. Nearly 250 years ago, America was born when we wrested freedom from a petty tyrant. Across the generations, Americans have preserved that freedom, expanded it, and in so doing, proved to the world that a government of, by, and for the people is strong and can endure. And those who came before us, the patriots at Normandy and Selma, Seneca Falls and Stonewall, on farmlands and factory floors, they did not struggle, sacrifice, and lay down their lives only to see us cede our fundamental freedoms. They didn't do that only to see us submit to the will of another petty tyrant. These United States of America, we are not a vessel for the schemes of wannabe dictators. The United States of America is the greatest idea humanity ever devised. A nation big enough to encompass all our dreams, strong enough to withstand any fracture or fissure between us, and fearless enough to imagine a future of possibilities. So, America, let us reach for that future. Let us fight for this beautiful country we love. And in 7 days, we have the power, each of you has the power to turn the page and start writing the next chapter in the most extraordinary story ever told. I thank you all. God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
We are standing at the crossroads of history tonight. It is a moment that can only be framed by our wisest voices. And so, after a short break here, it will be my honor to introduce author and Pulitzer Prize winner Isabella Wilkerson, who has taught us so much in her important books about how America got to here. Isabella Wilkerson joins us next.
America, we know what Donald Trump has in mind. More chaos, more division, and policies that help those at the very top and hurt everyone else. I offer a different path, and I ask for your vote. And here is my pledge to you. I pledge to seek common ground and common sense solutions to make your life better. I am not looking to score political points. I am looking to make progress. I pledge to listen to experts, to those who will be impacted by the decisions I make, and to people who disagree with me. Unlike Donald Trump, I don't believe people who disagree with me are the enemy. He wants to put them in jail. I'll give them a seat at the table. I pledge to you to approach my work with the joy and optimism that comes from making a difference in people's lives. And I pledge to be a president for all Americans. And to always put country above party and self.
It is an honor to have Isabel Wilkerson joining our discussion. She is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of the New York Times bestseller, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. This is such an important moment in our history, and I am wondering what we are seeing. And one thing I'm wondering is how, especially tonight with the contrast she drew in that speech, how can this person who's done everything right, everything that you ask someone to do growing up in this society, does her homework, goes to college, goes to law school, prosecutor, attorney general, senator, vice president, running against a convicted felon who is grotesquely and obviously incompetent, who cannot speak English in any accepted form, how can that be as close as it is? Why doesn't she have 90% of the vote? What are we missing here?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be back here with you. Thank you. When we look at this, when people look at this as an election or only as an election, then it doesn't make sense.
Right.
When you look at this as an existential crisis over what the country will be, then it begins to make sense. People are not voting against their own interests. People are not voting against their own interests. They're voting for the interests that matter most to them. And for many, many, many Americans, as we saw on January 6th, this means maintaining their position at the very top of the American hierarchy, at the top of the American caste system, with all the rights and privileges that accrue to that. And that is not something that maybe is in the best interest of the planet or the country, but that is the best interest of the people as they ascertain it for themselves.
So, rich kid, growing up rich kid, Tucker Carlson, now professional, public, white racist, is up there on a Trump stage supporting the same candidate who someone living on Social Security somewhere in Arkansas, Alabama, and trying to get by is voting for that same candidate. And what unites them is that they are both voting for their caste in this society.
You know, caste is an arbitrary graded ranking of human value in this society, and it's what determines rights, privileges, who will be protected by the authorities and who will be attacked by the authorities. And so this system has been in place for 248 years. We were forged in revolution and in civil war. We should not be the least bit surprised at the enduring divisions that we are seeing right now, and this is rising up in part because of 2042. It's rising up in part because of the demographic shift that we are facing as a country. In 2020, the census of 2020 found that for the first time in American history, the historical majority in this country, white Americans, that group is the only group whose numbers fell for the first time in American history. All other groups were either the same or they rose slightly. And so that's an existential crisis for everyone, actually, because everyone is affected by the demographics of our country. And as a result of that, that is why we're seeing so much of the fixation on immigration. Who gets to be in this country? What parts of the world are immigrants from? What parts of the world are they welcome here in this country? And also the fixation on births, not just abortion, but on births. Because with Griswold, we know, the Supreme Court case involving Griswold, that birth control is also on the table. And so these things are coalescing as part of the existential crisis that we're facing as a country. And what we are tasked with having to do is to figure out how can we figure out a way to imagine what we could be as a nation, even if the demographics are not the same. But this sense of dread, the sense of fear, is what's driving so much of what we're seeing.
So if Kamala Harris wins by 1% of the vote, becomes the next president of the United States. What's driving the Trump vote doesn't disappear.
The question would be, what would be the backlash? What would be the response? Whatever happens with this election, first of all, it's not about this election or any singular election. This is something that is our inheritance as Americans. These divisions that we are experiencing now are part of our inheritance, and it doesn't go away after an election. The passions and the grievances and the insecurities and the fears will still be there. And we as a nation will be still dealing with the divide, this chasm between groups in our country. Remember, this was manufactured division. This is not about people being good or bad. We are the inheritors of the divisions that were created before there was a United States of America. And so our task now is to figure out, what do we do, regardless of the outcome of this election, what do we do as a nation to forge a new identity for ourselves, regardless of what the demographics do? Because this is going to be with us regardless.
And in 2042, we turn a demographic corner that changes what?
It means that the historic majority of white Americans would no longer be the majority. And we would be in a situation, a configuration that no one alive, no one would ever know how to experience that, because the United States has never experienced it. Now, I think we're seeing the rumblings of what happens because of what we've seen the last few years. This is a precursor to what, to the divisions and the rancor that could only grow if we don't get ahead of this as a nation.
Isabel Wilkerson, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This issue of caste explaining so much about the Trump vote was something that I did not focus on until I knew you were coming here tonight. And I feel like I finally have an explanation that I get. I just haven't had one before tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And when we come back, Steve Bannon got out of prison today and immediately started attacking our next guest, election lawyer Mark Elias. Donald Trump and Steve Bannon are correct to fear Mark Elias because he is ready to go into any courtroom in America to stop a Trump attempt to steal the election. Mark Elias joins us next. Yesterday, Republicans in Virginia asked the Supreme Court to reverse a federal judge's ruling that prevented them from purging suspected non-citizens from the voter rolls. The same day, the Republican National Committee and Pennsylvania Republicans asked the Supreme Court to block a ruling by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court allowing voters to cast a provisional ballot on Election Day if their mail ballots were disqualified due to a technical issue. Republicans are arguing that the state should be able to disqualify those ballots, even though Pennsylvania law affords voters the right to cast a provisional ballot. Today, a federal judge struck down another effort by Pennsylvania Republicans challenging the counting of some military and overseas voters' ballots in Pennsylvania. Steve Bannon, one of Donald Trump's teammates in his attempt to overturn the 2020 election, was released from prison today after serving time for refusing to comply with subpoenas from the January 6th committee. Bannon is a criminal defendant in New York in an unrelated case involving financial fraud. Today, Bannon said this about our next guest.
The Democrats are not going to give up. They just hired Mark Elias. And you only hire Mark Elias, who I think is the toughest election lawyer in the country. You only hire Mark Elias when you want to go to the mattresses.
Joining us now, the toughest election lawyer in the country, Mark Elias, voting rights litigation expert and founder of the Democracy Docket. Mark, what do you feel when you hear Steve Bannon say that?
You know, Steve Bannon is a lot of things, including, as you pointed out, a convicted felon. So, to be honest with you, I don't pay a whole lot of attention to the nonsense that he spews or the guests that on his show do. I do, take it as a backhanded compliment that he understands that when we litigate against him and the vote suppressors, when we take on Donald Trump and those who want to subvert the election results, we fight hard and we fight to win.
Can you take us through the Virginia situation at the Supreme Court, the Pennsylvania situation, and anything else you're looking at?
Yeah. So first of all, to put the context to this, there's been a lot of reporting about how many lawsuits the Republican Party has been filing recently. There's been a lot less coverage about how many lawsuits they have lost. So far, according to Democracy Docket, the Republican Party has lost 17 lawsuits this month. That is an extraordinarily losing streak. So one of those cases in Pennsylvania, as you pointed out, the Republican National Committee, very hopeful that they would allow, that they would be able to figure out a way for people who fill out mail-in ballots and make some technical mistake to not be able to then correct that mistake by voting a provisional ballot in person. Why on earth a political party would want to disenfranchise voters who correct the fact that they made a mistake and want to therefore fix it by casting a provisional ballot, I'll leave to you. Virginia, the Glenn Youngkin, who originally positioned themselves as something of a moderate, went all in with MAGA, and he wants to be able to violate federal law that prohibits the purging of voters within 90 days of an election. He lost that case in federal court. He's now brought that to the U.S. Supreme Court. I could go on and on. I mean, the Republican Party lost 2 lawsuits in North Carolina just today, a case in Pennsylvania just today. Yesterday, they lost one in Arizona. I mean, they're on quite the streak.
Are you concerned about any of these cases having a serious effect on Election Day?
Look, my job is to worry about everything, right? So I have a concern about everything. But I think if I am someone out in the audience who is watching this, I think what you ought to be concerned about is making sure that you have a plan to vote and that you vote. And if you do that, I promise you, me and other lawyers are going to make sure that everything's going to be fine after that. Just like after 2020, there was a lot of efforts by Donald Trump, but my legal team and we beat Donald Trump in court more than 60 times. And, that and the rest is history, as they say.
So talk about that. I have taken a great deal of confidence from what we actually saw after Election Day 4 years ago, because what I saw was a bunch of litigation, most of it entirely frivolous, and all of it was defeated by proper legal responses by you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And look, this is the thing. Donald Trump uses litigation not to win cases. He uses litigation as a tool to affect the political environment. He wants people to believe that there is chaos. He wants to lay the groundwork for a grievance structure that allows him to say that he was cheated rather than he lost fair and square. But none of that is going to change the outcome. Like, at the end of the day, Donald Trump is going to lie about the outcome of the 2024 election. I mean, people keep asking me, am I worried about him declaring victory before the ballots are counted? Well, he lies about everything. So why wouldn't he lie about that? I mean, you cover every night his lies. So yes, he will lie about the outcome of the election, but that's not going to change the results. So if people vote and people do their part in getting out the vote, let's not worry about Donald Trump's lies, because we're not going to convince him to stop doing that.
Are you confident that the Democrats and your team, that you have the resources you need for everything that's going to happen starting the day after Election Day?
I do. Look, the Harris campaign has put together really a all-star team of lawyers and litigators and technical experts in individual states. And, it is headed by a wonderful woman named Dana Remus, who's doing a great job. And I'm proud to be part of that team as the lead recount lawyer. And I am confident that in the end, Vice President Harris's interests will be protected.
I don't give betting advice on television, but if you're betting on anything in this election, bet on Mark Elias. Mark Elias, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. What would you do if you were an 18-year-old who knew that your father participated in the January 6th attack on the Capitol? Would you turn your father into the FBI? That's the decision our next guest had to make. That decision is now the subject of a brilliant new play called Fatherland, currently playing in New York City at New York City Center. The young man who had to make that dramatic decision that is portrayed in that play will join us next.
And Donald Trump has told us his priorities for a second term. He says that one of his highest priorities is to set free the violent extremists who insulted those law enforcement officers on January 6th.
With Vice President Harris revisiting the scene of Donald Trump's January 6th crimes, where he urged his mob of followers to go to the Capitol and fight like hell. Thousands of people are reliving how that day changed their lives, including the families of the people who have been arrested, convicted, and sentenced to prison for attacking the Capitol. Some of those family members agree with what their convicted relatives did, but many of them, we don't know how many of them, sharply disagree with what their family members did on that day. One of those family members who disagrees is our next guest, Jackson Reffitt, who was 18 years old and living with his parents in Texas when his father, who he watched descend into Trump paranoia, drove to Washington with his guns to help install Donald Trump in the presidency. That story is told in a brilliant and powerful, moving new play called Fatherland, now at New York City Center. Conceived and directed by Stephen Sachs, Fatherland uses public records and trial transcripts to tell this real-life father-son drama.
Everybody who was there on the 6th should be locked up for the rest of their lives. Everyone.
Are you recording this?
What?
Are you recording this?
No! I am not recording.
You better not be. Don't betray me. Don't ruin this family. Do not put this family in jeopardy.
I am not the one that is putting our family in jeopardy.
If you cross a line here, I will do my duty. I will have no other choice. Choose a side! Choose a side or die! I put you in this world. I can take you out. Don't turn your back on me!
I'm not turning my back!
Whoever turns his back on me is a traitor! Is that what's happening here? If you turn me in, you are a traitor. And traitors get shot.
Jackson Reffitt called the FBI to turn in his father, who is now serving a 7-year sentence. When asked about the possibility of his father being released, along with all the other January 6th prisoners, by Donald Trump on Inauguration Day in January, Jackson Reffitt told the New York Times, "It's terrifying." Joining us now is Jackson Reffitt. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Jackson. I just saw this play last week, and I am still in the buzz of it. It is just so powerful, as you know. I know you've seen it, and you lived through it. What will it mean to you if all of the January 6th prisoners are released on Inauguration Day?
It means I'm always going to be in danger. Trump has said that one of the biggest targets is the enemy within. And I'm sure from a lot of perspectives, such as Trump's, I'm one of those examples. So if my father and everyone involved in January 6th is released, I don't know what else to think other than fear.
Do you have any hope that anything has changed for your father by being in prison, and he might possibly come out wiser from that experience?
So one of the biggest regrets I have is being ignorant to the fact that he might have gotten better. Prison might have helped him. It might have pushed him away from those militias and those extreme groups. Yet, as time has gone on, he's only gotten more radicalized in prison by being in with like-minded people. And my biggest regret is not being aware that would happen, and it's only gotten worse.
There is so much complexity in your relationship that is revealed in the court transcripts, in the brilliant cross-examination by Larry Poindexter, who plays your father's defense attorney, Anna Kajo, who plays the prosecutor, asking Patrick Kelleher, who we saw playing you, those questions. And it really is you. It really is exactly what you went through in the courtroom. Ron Botita playing your father so powerfully. And when we sit there in the theater, seeing what you go through, one of the words that gets repeated more than once is the word love. And that is a word repeated between you and your father for each other. There is a complexity to the feelings here that in the story that is told here that is so profound and so rich. Can you describe your feelings for your father now?
He's my father. I still love him, but that does not justify any of his actions, and it won't if he continues to act like this. He raised me to be the person I am today, the honest, the trustworthy person that I've become. He gave me all the privilege I have in my life to be who I am because he gave that to me, because he raised me. And I still love him. He means the world to me. And that's what made that decision so hard, is because if I wouldn't have made that decision, who knows how far it would have gone? Who could have gotten hurt if he could have gotten hurt? All this paranoia built up over the years. I could only imagine.
Stephen Sachs takes credit as a director. He does not take credit as a playwright, I notice, in the credits of this. He conceived this, but he used the transcripts, and I think is modestly not taking credit as a playwright because of that. But the story is all yours, and it is all your father's, and it is all real. Every word of it is real. If you could speak to your father tonight, what would you say to him?
I would tell him again that I'm sorry, and that I understand the position he was put in as a father in times of hardship, horrible, horrible hardship, with responsibilities that very few can relate to, with that much anxiety and being that scared, not knowing what's going to happen, and making that choice, thinking that that's going to go save your family. You can't help but feel for something like that. And I do, and I love him, but I can't say anything to him other than please stop. Please stop going down this wrong path. And it's so hard to talk to him now, given everything that's happened. There's so much heartbreak when it comes to calling him. It's next to impossible. But if I were able to speak to him now, it would be, I love you.
Jackson Ruffett, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
The play is called Fatherland. It is running at New York City Center in Manhattan until November 10th. This is a must-see play. If you can see one play in New York, this is it. We'll be right back. The sad news of the day is that we lost Teri Garr today. Teri Garr was the kind of actress who you loved if you never met her, and if you did meet her, you loved her even more. She was a devoted mother to Molly, and I hope we can find more time at some point in this busy news week on this program to say more about the great Teri Garr.